The dawn had just started to settle over the hills outside Santa Fe, wrapping everything in a thick, mysterious fog. The world seemed quiet, almost holding its breath, as the sunlight worked its way through the haze. For Evelyn, those early hours had become a sort of numb routine, her mornings shaped by the same lonely silence that had filled her days after Emily and Michael disappeared 6 years before. She sat by the window with her cup of coffee, barely aware of the light changing outside, when her phone rang unexpectedly. The sound sliced right through the stillness of the moment, catching her off guard. For a second, she just stared at the phone, her hand hovering above it as if she was afraid to answer. It was her old friend Rachel on the other end. Rachel spoke fast, her voice both excited and careful, because she knew the kind of hope that could be cruel. She told Evelyn that something had turned up deep in the foothills north of town, something hidden out there for years. Rachel didn't have all the details yet, but just hearing those words was enough to make Evelyn's heart race. She recognized the crossroads she was suddenly standing at, a mixture of fear, longing, and a dizzying sense that everything she'd been waiting for might actually be within reach. For Evelyn, hope had become a dangerous emotion, one she had taught herself to keep quiet and buried for her own protection. But now it surged up, raw and unwelcome, desperate for answers. Rachel kept talking about the discovery, her sentences running into each other as she tried to get it all out. She mentioned local police and a team of searchers who had found something buried in a ravine near the old national forest. The area had always been hard to access, wild and secretive, the sort of place teenagers whispered about at bonfires. Now, finally, there was a reason to look there, something more than rumors and unsatisfying leads. Evelyn clutched her phone, tighter, her mind racing through memories of 6 years spent stuck between grief and the flicker of hope that never quite gave out. She was scared of what might be waiting in those woods, but more scared, maybe, at the thought she might finally get the answers she'd lost so much to find. Evelyn tried to steady her shaking hands as she scribbled down the address Rachel gave her. Every line of those numbers and letters felt heavy, like they might open a door she wasn't sure she was ready to face. Still holding the phone, she worked hard to keep her voice steady, not wanting Rachel to hear just how nervous she truly was. After they said goodbye and Evelyn finally set the phone down, it rang again, making her jump. This time, it was Greg. Someone she had come to rely on more than she could ever explain. He was Michael's old business partner, but in the years since the disappearance, he had become so much more. A friend, a protector, the person Evelyn called when the weight of everything threatened to crush her. Greg seemed to always know when to check in, and today was no different. When Evelyn explained where she needed to go, he didn't hesitate. Without making it a big thing, he simply asked if she wanted company. She could hear the concern in his voice, a quiet kind of care that offered comfort even when nothing else did. The invitation was a relief. Evelyn realized she wanted, maybe even needed, Greg with her for this. There was too much history between them, and too much pain attached to every mile they would cross, driving out to the old ravine. She packed her bag with a jacket, a half-full notebook, and the photo of Emily she always kept close. When Greg pulled into her driveway in his old blue Subaru, she slipped into the passenger seat, and they exchanged a quick, uncertain smile. The drive out of Santa Fe was stretched with thick silence. Sometimes Greg glanced at her, searching for anything in her face that might tell him how she was really doing. But Evelyn mostly stared out at the low fog, thinking about all she had lost and all she might find. Every curve in the road seemed to move her further from the life she once had, and closer to an unknown she had spent years fearing. The world outside the window grew paler and more unfamiliar, the sun just starting to burn through the mist. Whatever waited at the forest's edge was not just a possible answer. It was the line between what she had survived and what she still might hope for. As Greg turned onto the old dirt road, Evelyn felt herself crossing in small steps that invisible boundary between her old grief and the uncertain promise of something new. The trail that led to the center of Carson National Forest was rough and tangled, winding through tall brush and uneven ground. Evelyn had made the walk before, but never with this tight knot of dread and hope sitting in her stomach. Greg stuck close by her side, carrying a backpack with a couple of water bottles and a flashlight just in case the clouds rolled back in. Rachel waited for them at the start of the path, her hair tucked under a baseball cap and a worried look on her face. They barely spoke as they started off, the sharp scent of pine and earth mixing with the cool air. Each step forward became harder for Evelyn, not just because the path got steeper, but because the closer she drew to whatever lay ahead, the more her mind dove back into old questions and memories. Rachel led the way, brushing branches aside and pointing out the colored tape that marked the searcher's path. Even with all that guidance, Evelyn's hope was put to the test, with every branch snagging on her jacket and every exposed root threatening to trip her. A few times, Greg reached out a hand to steady her, silent but steadying in a way that let her know she was not alone. They moved deeper into the forest, the sky above barely visible through the trees. Rumors had always insisted that something had remained hidden out here, just waiting for the right eyes to find it. Today, at last, that rumor felt real enough to sting. Finally, near a clearing, they came upon a section roped off by yellow tape, with a handful of officials quietly working nearby. The ground was disturbed, black earth pushed aside in a rough circle. Evelyn stopped as if she had hit an invisible wall. Rachel gently touched her elbow, nodding toward the center of the clearing, where tangled cloth and broken wicker poked out from the soil. The old balloon's colors, once bright and wild, were now faded and torn, strips of canvas mixed with twisted metal and scattered fragments of the basket. Evelyn's breath caught as she tried to take it all in. It was impossible to pretend any more that what happened had been a simple accident. There was a story here, clawing its way up through the dirt, begging for the truth to finally come out. Her knees felt weak, but she kept her eyes on the wreckage, searching for some answer to carry her out of the forest, no matter what it turned out to be. Evelyn took a slow step forward, the leaves crackling under her shoes as she moved closer to what remained of the old hot air balloon. She stared at the faded fabric and the battered frame, searching for anything that might echo all her memories of bright mornings spent at launch sites with Michael. That familiar striping, the swirl of blue and orange, was unmistakable. She remembered the evening years ago when she and Michael had chosen those exact colors together, sitting at their kitchen table, drawing rough sketches in a spiral notebook. Now those same colors looked ghostly, their once cheerful energy swallowed up by dirt and time. It sent a rush of relief through her, twisted up with a dreadful chill, a strange comfort in finally seeing something so personal up close, and a terror at the finality it suggested. Greg stayed back a bit, watching her with worried eyes. Rachel moved beside Evelyn, quietly pointing out bits of the basket's woodwork that was still visible. The custom handles Michael had added last minute. The very same ones Evelyn had helped stain years earlier. Those details drove home how real it all was. This was not someone else's tragedy. It belonged to them. Evelyn had always thought that finding the balloon might bring answers she could hold on to, but as Rachel explained the scene, how the officials had carefully combed through the wreckage in every direction, how there was no sign of any bodies, her relief faded. Instead, fresh questions piled up. If neither Michael nor Emily had been found here, where had they gone? Had they survived the crash and wandered off, or had something else happened entirely? That silence hung thick over the clearing, heavier than any of them could talk through. Even the officers seemed to sense it, stepping carefully, hands in pockets, as if afraid to disturb some invisible line between what was known and what was still hiding. Every scrap of fabric, every dented metal clasp called up more memories and more doubts. For every piece she recognized, Evelyn remembered a moment of laughter, a small argument, a fleeting look between her and Michael, or her daughter's voice echoing across a field. Standing in that quiet, surrounded by fragments of a life she had tried so long to mourn, Evelyn realized the truth might run deeper than anything she had ever imagined. The balloon's battered shell challenged her to accept more uncertainty, and left her holding on to hope even as the ground beneath her felt unsteady. One of the officers carefully waved Evelyn over, and she noticed a few freshly dug patches of earth around the balloon wreckage. He quietly told her the strange part. This crash hadn't just happened and been left to rot. Someone, at some point, had gone to the trouble of covering up the whole site. The balloon remains had been deliberately buried, the soil packed down to hide the evidence. That fact landed like a punch. Evelyn felt as if the ground itself was full of secrets, and the story she had always been told might have been a lie. Greg's face turned pale as Rachel absorbed the words too. For years, they had all imagined a tragic accident. Wind gusts gone wrong. Maybe a line snapped or a landing missed in the wild New Mexico forest. But with the knowledge that someone had hidden the balloon, 100 new possibilities flooded in. Who would do that and why? Was it to keep people from searching, to redirect blame, or to erase something darker altogether from the past? Evelyn's grief, so neatly contained for 6 years, now pulled her in a new direction. It was no longer only about loss. It was about betrayal, about fear, and the pieces of the story that had never made sense until now. She crouched by a chunk of burnt fabric, fingertips brushing dirt from its charred edge. Each item she touched seemed to ask her silent questions. If someone went to such lengths, could Michael and Emily have survived the crash? Could her daughter still be out there somewhere, or was she caught in the web of somebody else's choices? Evelyn felt tears prick at her eyes, the ache carried by hope instead of only pain. For all the fear and heartbreak, she could not help the thought that maybe, just maybe, Emily hadn't died out here, not in the way Evelyn had believed for so long. It was clear now, this wasn't about fate or misadventure, at least not anymore. There were human hands behind all of this, and that meant there might still be a path toward the truth. The site felt less like a memorial and more like the beginning of a trail she was supposed to follow. Evelyn looked at Greg and Rachel, her voice a shaky whisper, and said, "If somebody tried to hide it, then maybe they left something else behind." The air was heavy with new questions, but for the first time in 6 long years, her sorrow had shifted, tinged not just with loss, but with a fighting edge of curiosity and hope. As the forensics team continued their slow, careful examination, in the woods, Greg's focus settled on things most people would walk right past. He crouched close to the ruined metal frame of the balloon, almost ignoring the bits of faded fabric and scattered basket, just to study a small metal plate bolted near the base. It was engraved with serial numbers and company logos, the kind of technical detail that would mean almost nothing to an outsider. Greg didn't just glance at it. He pulled out his phone, snapping quick photos from different angles, making sure no mark went unnoticed. He leaned in even closer, running his thumb along the edges and jotting a few notes for himself in a well-worn green notebook. To Evelyn, nothing about this seemed strange. It was exactly the way Greg had always handled anything connected with SkyWest Aeronautics, the company he and Michael had built together from scratch. Even after the disaster, Greg always seemed to know the right forms to file or the right people to call. She was grateful for it most of the time, because someone needed to cover those bases while she'd been caught in the slow-moving waves of grief and confusion. But as she watched him now, so focused, his emotions hidden, moving from scrap to scrap with the same neutral face. It made her pause. Greg had spent the past 6 years being steady and supportive. Still, there was an edge to his calm that suddenly felt out of place to Evelyn. Even now, kneeling in the wreckage of the balloon that had once been their collective dream, she could not read anything on his face. She wondered how he managed to keep himself so collected when her own hands shook, just holding an old piece of canvas. Maybe it was the years of practice. Or maybe Greg just processed things differently, but a new thought started to bother her. A tickle of suspicion she did not want to acknowledge. He stood up quickly, brushing dirt from his knees and shooting off a few emails right there in the woods. When Evelyn asked what he was looking at, Greg explained in his even voice that he wanted to double-check which batch number it was, just to clear up any confusion with the insurance and the police reports. Evelyn nodded, but inside, she wondered how he could push away the sadness so easily. His reactions felt a little too rehearsed, and for the first time, Evelyn found herself questioning what she truly knew about Greg and about the tragedy that had shaped both of their lives ever since. The forensics team started calling the group over with short, serious voices. Evelyn walked carefully to where a few of the technicians knelt beside the basket, gloves on, and heads bowed as though they were in a kind of quiet argument with the evidence itself. She could see it there too. Small stains darkened the tangled wicker, some dry, washed out by time and New Mexico rains, but unmistakable all the same. As one of the investigators lifted a mangled part of the fabric, there was also clear, shredded damage in the balloon material, more intense than what a crash landing usually left behind. Evelyn listened, fists clenched tight at her sides, as one of the techs explained their theory. The blood could have meant an injury, maybe from falling, debris or a bad landing, but the heavy tearing in the fibers didn't match a simple wind shear or rough descent. It looked more like something violent had happened mid-air or right as the balloon came down. One of the officers mentioned the possibility of a struggle, maybe even a physical fight, and that suggestion left Evelyn reeling. Her mind spun in circles. Could Michael and Emily, or even a stranger, have been caught in something much worse than an accident, way above the trees, with no one around to help? Rachel stayed close, offering a tense squeeze on her arm, while Greg's expression never changed. He gave measured answers to every question from the police, nodded when they asked if he would help track any missing inventory or documentation, and repeated that SkyWest Aeronautics would cooperate with anything the authorities needed. Evelyn could not help but notice that not even this new horror shocked Greg into any real show of emotion. It was as if he had always expected the story to get worse. As the daylight faded and the crime scene tape fluttered along the forest edge, Evelyn followed the team back to the parking lot in silence. Her brain replayed grim possibilities. A balloon meant for celebration and adventure, upended by chaos and blood. What had seemed like a tragic loss now hovered behind her as a nightmare she did not fully understand. More than anything, she felt swallowed by questions about Michael, Emily, Greg, and even herself. The day had started with hope for answers, but ended with nothing solved. Just a cold mystery, growing larger with every careful footstep out of the woods. Making their way back along the same narrow trail, Greg kept a gentle hand on Evelyn's shoulder, moving quietly through the low brush as dusk fell between the trees. He spoke only when she seemed to want it, offering soft words about police procedures and what the next few days might hold in terms of forms, interviews, and all. The details he always seemed to have ready. Whatever had happened in the woods, Greg never dropped his steady act or his role as the practical one, organizing, reassuring, already thinking about the things to handle that could help keep their everyday world spinning. By the time the two of them climbed into the pickup truck and headed back toward Taos. The darkness outside left Evelyn all the more aware of the uncertainty now living in her chest. Greg offered to stay over for a while, promising to take care of loose paperwork and see if there were any calls from insurance or the authorities later that night. He parked by the curb outside her place, and after asking if she was up to it, unlocked her front door and stepped into the familiar kitchen. Greg moved around like he had 100 times before, putting a fresh pot of coffee on, pulling mugs from the high shelf, and even cleaning a little as he went. Evelyn found herself following the motions, setting out plates and napkins the way she once did every single morning before the world flipped upside down. The smell of coffee and the scrape of silverware were almost comforting, but her mind would not relax. The routine felt more fragile than ever, and she kept glancing at Greg as he stirred sugar into his cup, wondering if she could really trust the comfort his predictability offered. Every sound seemed magnified, the drip of coffee, her own breathing, the quiet thump as Greg dropped papers on the table before sitting down. She tried to lose herself in the normalcy of it all, asking Greg about work or something trivial, but the sense of being watched would not leave her. She realized it was not just the forest or the shadow of the wreckage haunting her. It was right here, in the living room, in the memories that clung to the walls, and even in Greg's presence. It occurred to Evelyn that sometimes the true threat was not waiting in some far-off place, but existed right among the people you thought you knew best. The everyday actions now seemed like a mask for questions too big to ignore. Evelyn excused herself after breakfast was done, letting Greg know she needed a minute alone. She slipped quietly into the bathroom, closing the door and flicking on the harsh light. Her hands were shaking, so she sat on the closed toilet and pulled out her phone, needing someone who was not right in her living room, not tangled in the thick knots of grief and old history. She scrolled to her cousin Jen's name, a mechanical engineer with a reputation for cool-headedness, even when others were falling apart. Evelyn started typing, her thumb flying across the screen as she poured out everything. The discovery of the wreck, the way it had been buried, the strange new evidence from the forensics team, and the unsettling calm that Greg never seemed to lose. Jen's replies came almost instantly, each message short and direct, her brain already running through the mechanical side of things. She asked about specific parts that Evelyn barely remembered, valves, fuel lines, connection points, anything that might fail or be tampered with. One particular question made Evelyn's breath catch. Had anyone ever looked into the possibility that the balloon's mechanisms had been messed with on purpose? She went on to explain, in her usual matter-of-fact tone, that accidents like these sometimes masked sabotage, especially when profit, jealousy, or even personal grudges existed. Inside a close-knit circle, Jen told her what to check for and made a list of questions that someone should have asked right after the crash. Who had access? Who was responsible for maintenance? Had anyone noticed anything unusual before the flight took off? Evelyn felt a sudden burst of focus. The idea that there might be answers hidden in places she knew and people she trusted pushed away a bit of the fear and confusion. She realized the horror from the woods did not have to paralyze her. She could do something, ask questions, look for records, dig for clues that would not just help her understand what happened, but maybe finally make sense of the years of pain. She sent Jen a quiet thank you, her jaw set with new purpose. With that single conversation, Evelyn let her fear turn to action. For the first time since the phone rang that morning with news from the police, she had a thread to grab onto, and she was not letting go. When Evelyn stepped back into the living room, she expected to find Greg still fussing with paperwork or maybe making another pot of coffee. Instead, the house felt strangely empty. the echoes of her footsteps bouncing in the quiet space. Greg's bag was slouched by the armchair, and his phone and laptop were still lit up on the coffee table, pinging with notifications. She glanced around, expecting him to step out from the kitchen or maybe down the hallway, but there was no sign of him. Trying not to intrude, but unable to ignore the glowing screens, Evelyn's eyes drifted across the open laptop. A string of messages was open, not from the police, not from insurance, but instead from people who seemed oddly cheerful. There were short bursts of text full of compliments, some little jokes about SkyWest Aeronautics, and what looked like private congratulations on handling things so calmly through a business setback. Mixed in were hints that made her stomach churn, half-hidden digs about grabbing new opportunities, or even gentle praise for finally being out from under someone else's shadow. It struck Evelyn as all wrong, not the way anyone should talk only hours after discovering a tragedy's horrifying new side. She lingered, reading only a few lines, telling herself she was just trying to understand. The tone unsettled her. There was no shock, no outrage, and not even a decent attempt at sympathy. One chat flashed up from a colleague she did not know well, someone praising Greg's timing and asking if he wanted to get drinks to celebrate some good news. The words did not make sense. Was this how people talked about a tragedy if they knew more than they let on? Had Greg spun a story of his own about what happened, or worse, did he see this renewed investigation as a step forward for himself? Evelyn felt a prickle crawl down her back. She tried to rationalize the strange exchanges, telling herself maybe it was just business, cold, thoughtless, but not sinister. Yet the more she replayed the lines in her mind, the more her anxiety grew. Nothing in those messages lined up with what she had witnessed in the woods, or with the pain that had haunted her every day. Beneath the routine of shared work and a friendship, Evelyn felt the foundation shift. For the first time, she truly wondered what Greg had known all along, and what he might still be hiding. They had barely finished their coffee when Evelyn quietly suggested that she wanted a closer look at SkyWest Aeronautics, the company that had defined Michael's dreams and so much of their tangled lives. She brought it up carefully, saying she wanted to understand what really went on behind the scenes, what Michael had poured his heart into. Greg froze at first, his hands going still on the rim of his mug. For a moment, he looked almost thrown off, like he had expected everything else but this request. He gave a tight smile, excusing himself to check his phone, mentioning how busy the day was supposed to be, how work was piling up at the office. Evelyn waited, not giving in to his hesitation. She knew that if she let Greg wriggle out of it, now she would regret it for months, maybe even years. So she pressed again, saying she felt she owed it to Michael, to herself, to see the place where so much had started and maybe ended. Greg sighed, his resistance barely noticeable, but there in the way his voice dropped just a bit and his shoulders hunched. He agreed, but Evelyn could tell it was not the answer he wanted to give. They drove to SkyWest's low-slung building. On Paseo del Pueblo Norte in silence, the thrum of the old Toyota pickup filling the gaps between them. As Greg drove, Evelyn caught him looking more often in the rearview mirror than usual, eyes snapping from her reflection to the road and back again. She tried to focus on the sweep of sagebrush rolling past the windows, but the tension built with every mile. When they finally pulled up in front of the small hangar and office, Greg's hands kept moving, tapping the steering wheel, smoothing a wrinkle in his shirt, fussing with his phone. He went through the entrance with the same steady walk he always had, but the small, nervous movements did not match his practiced calm. For the first time in years of shared coffee breaks and late-night paperwork, Evelyn saw Greg in a way she never had before, each awkward gesture speaking louder than the polite words he offered. There was no comfort in his old routines now, only the uneasy sense that something important was about to break out into the open. When they stepped through the glass doors of Sky West Aeronautics, Evelyn and Greg were greeted by Denise, Greg's ever-polite assistant. Denise wore her gentle smile and a name tag with a rainbow pin, seeming like the only bit of color in a mostly grey lobby. She ushered them on a loosely planned tour, launching into careful explanations about how the business ran, how safety and schedules always came first, and adding in bits about the company's history. Evelyn nodded along, watching old framed photos of Michael with different flight crews and ribbons from the Albuquerque International Balloon Fiesta lining the hallways. Seeing Michael mid-laugh in one picture, his arm flung around Greg at an after-party almost made Evelyn's shoulders drop, almost. But under all the tidy explanations and reminders of tradition, tension built with every step. People at their desks gave furtive glances and quiet nods. No one asked Evelyn any direct questions about why she was really there. They passed clusters of engineers and ground crew by the windows, each group stiffening as Greg walked past, one or two quickly shutting laptops or tidying up their workspaces. Denise kept her tone upbeat, but her eyes flicked nervously between Greg and Evelyn, as though she was desperate to avoid any hint of trouble. They finally reached the maintenance hangar, where the smell of fuel and grease hung in the air and toolboxes lined the walls. Evelyn's heart hammered. This was where Michael had spent entire days, talking through every safety check, making meticulous notes. She glanced at Greg, then directly asked if someone from outside could have sabotaged a balloon, or if there were routine checks, who signed off on repairs, who had access, how everything worked behind the scenes. Denise hesitated, fingers drumming a little pattern on her clipboard. Greg gave a half-hearted rundown about security protocols, repeating simple facts, but never answering Evelyn's sharp, pointed questions. Instead of details, she heard, "We always double-check," and "Our records are in order," but nothing solid. Evelyn took it all in, looking from Greg to the other staff, whose gazes slid away from hers. The fear in the room felt heavy, not about her questions, but about what might happen if the wrong truth slipped out. The air seemed charged with secrets waiting, in the wings, ready to be exposed if anyone pressed too hard. For the first time, Evelyn sensed she was circling the real story, one just out of reach, behind locked doors and nervous silences. After they left the maintenance area, Denise led Evelyn to a small waiting room, apologizing for keeping her. There, the room was full of soft chairs and magazines about hot air balloons, meant to be cozy, but feeling more like a holding pen. Denise nervously offered Evelyn some coffee and said Greg would be back soon to answer more questions, but it was hard to miss the strain in her face. Evelyn took a breath and politely asked if she could take a look at Michael's old office, saying she thought it would help to remember him in his element and maybe bring her some closure. Denise hesitated, glancing at a big set of keys on her belt, and launched into a string of excuses. They were reorganizing. It was being used for storage. The keys were usually with Greg, and anyway, it was not a good day for a visit. She tried to smooth things over by offering Evelyn a company pamphlet and promising they would arrange a proper visit sometime soon. The excuses piled up until Evelyn knew she was not getting in, at least not by asking. It was clear there was something in that office that nobody wanted her to see. Not now, maybe not ever. While Denise's anxiety was obvious, it tipped into something sharper when she picked up the phone and called someone, her voice pitched low. She turned her back as she spoke and threw words like urgent and unexpected visitor into the middle of sentences. By the time Denise hung up, she was in a rush, quickly apologizing that she needed to help organize something for Mr. Turner, the general manager, and then hustled out, leaving Evelyn alone in a space that suddenly felt both too empty and far too revealing. The hallway outside was quiet, mostly deserted. For a moment, Evelyn pressed her hands into her lap, thinking maybe she should wait, but her instincts, honed by years as a reporter before Michael's accident, kicked in. She did not want to be passive anymore, letting curiosity take over. She slipped out of the waiting room, glancing both ways before carefully making her way down the corridor. She felt a mix of guilt and determination, but this time she was not letting polite excuses bury the truth. She started searching, peeking into open doors, running her finger along file cabinets and desks, looking for anything that felt out of place, or maybe finally a piece of the story that had always slipped out of sight. As Evelyn moved quietly down the hallway, careful not to draw attention, she passed the door to Greg's office, left slightly ajar. Inside, the clatter of panic was unmistakable. Denise, instead of helping with any management issue as she claimed, was leaning over a stack of files, her hands shaking as she stuffed thick folders, some barely read, into a cardboard box. She seemed especially focused on sorting through documents dated that summer when Michael disappeared. A few sheets already had red marker lines slashed across them, or sticky notes that read, "To shred." It looked like she was in a hurry, trying to get rid of anything suspicious before anyone else thought to look. Evelyn pushed the door open just enough to make her presence clear. Denise froze, her face draining of color. For a moment they both stood there without saying anything, the silence filled with the guilt of being caught. Trying to steady herself, Evelyn asked about the records from the year Michael died, pointing at the reports Denise was so desperate to hide. Her own voice was calm, edged just enough to let Denise know she would not be brushed off. Why was anything from that summer being tossed away now? And who ordered it? Denise's mouth opened and closed a few times before she finally managed to say it was just routine file maintenance, nothing more. But her answer came out thin and unconvincing, especially when Evelyn noticed the sweat building on her brow. Denise said the records were only duplicates, that Greg had mentioned old paperwork would clutter the storage if left. Still, as she turned her back, Evelyn noticed a trembling in Denise's hands and the way her eyes darted to a drawer in the corner, where another folder rested, this one marked with Michael's name. The conversation turned even tenser. Evelyn pressed about what might have been missed in the original investigations, or why there seemed to be gaps in those records. Denise's fear grew with every question, her body practically curling in on itself. She admitted in a whisper that some files were never put into the official archive, that Greg had decided some reports just weren't necessary for anyone outside the company. By the time Evelyn mentioned the possibility of the police reviewing everything again, Denise looked ready to bolt. Evelyn realized she was not just chasing shadows. The answers she wanted were right in front of her, close enough to touch, but so was a risk she had never expected. It was no longer just about digging into the past. Now the real danger felt very present, creeping into every room. The air inside SkyWest Aeronautics was growing stifling, heavy with the sense that everyone knew something they were desperate to keep hidden. As Evelyn walked the corridor again, her earlier confrontation with Denise still playing in her mind, she noticed the looks between staff. Folks muttered anxiously near the copy machine, while a couple of managers whispered in the break room. She caught fragments that made her heart race. People talking in hurried tones about moving boxes out of sight and rescheduling meetings with big accounts. Nobody dared say why, but it felt obvious that the entire office was scrambling to clean up before the police showed up for another round of questions. Evelyn watched as a few employees rushed by, carrying sealed boxes to the back exit. They barely made eye contact, each step hurried, as if the cardboard might burn holes in their hands. One woman in purchasing even stopped mid-conversation when she saw Evelyn coming, then pretended to look for a lost pen. The nervousness in the air was almost contagious. It did not take much for Evelyn to realize these boxes were not meant to be found, certainly not by detectives or curious widows. Schedules were being shifted, calls bumped up or put off. The receptionist was fielding call after call, all while sneaking glances at a growing list of urgent reminders taped to her monitor. Just as Evelyn tried to decide whether to follow the movement out the back or double back to Greg's office, her phone buzzed. It was Detective Lee, whose persistent, straightforward tone always cut through the fog. This time he asked if she was somewhere she could talk. When Evelyn stepped outside into the parking lot, the noises of people hastily moving supplies fading. Behind her, Lee's news was blunt and left no room for confusion. The forensics team had proof of sabotage in the balloon system and clear evidence that there had been a struggle in the gondola. More than that, remains had been recovered at the edge of the old arroyos, beyond the company's property line, a small, undeniable link to Michael. Hearing this, the cold knot in Evelyn's chest turned into a chill that spread to her fingertips. Suddenly, every strange look and every rushed effort inside SkyWest made sense. The company was scrambling not for her sake, but because the truth about Michael's death and Greg's possible involvement was now impossible to hide. The circle was closing, and for the first time, Evelyn truly saw how close Greg was to being caught in the center of it. As Evelyn ended her tense call with Detective Lee, she was hit with a clear and pressing directive. Get out of SkyWest Aeronautics right away. Lee's voice, usually unflappable, had tightened as he spelled out the risk she was facing. He worried that with evidence coming to light, those involved would do anything to stay ahead of the investigation, including making sure nosy witnesses kept quiet. For the first time, Evelyn truly felt the danger lacing the halls she had once thought of as just another workplace. The nervous glances and clipped conversations she had brushed off earlier were suddenly ominous. These people were not just uncomfortable, they were protecting something. Trying not to draw attention, Evelyn retraced her steps toward the exit. She kept her chin low, feeling like the whole staff was watching her, their eyes heavy with suspicion and their movements too quick to be routine. Each closed door and muffled phone call seemed to signal she was surrounded by a network of people working together, all determined to keep the company's real story out of public view. She almost reached the door when she caught a glimpse of Greg through the slats of a half-closed window by the side entrance. He stood in the parking lot, talking in hushed tones to two men Evelyn had never seen before, men who did not look like suppliers or employees. Greg held a thick envelope, counting the cash before handing it over. The men motioned to a grey rental truck idling at the far edge of the lot, where others loaded up several cardboard boxes that looked identical to the ones she had. Seen being quietly moved from the office just minutes ago, it dawned on Evelyn what was happening. Greg was not just hiding paperwork or deleting files from a computer. He was helping to cover something up for good. The evidence, whatever might tie SkyWest or himself to Michael's death, was about to disappear, packed away in plain sight, and ready to be dumped or shredded far from here. The decision from Detective Lee to leave immediately echoed in her head, but Evelyn's instincts were louder. All her grief and quiet rage from the last several years fueled her now. She realized these few moments would decide everything. Ignoring the order to leave, she sketched out her own plan on the fly, determined to intervene and do whatever it took to keep those boxes from vanishing. Some truths, she thought, were worth the risk, no matter what might happen next. Tempted to simply watch from afar, Evelyn made her way to her old blue Subaru without letting anyone notice. Her hands shook as she unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat. She watched the grey rental truck as Greg gave one last look around, shut the trunk with a thud, and slipped behind the wheel next to the two strangers. The truck pulled out of the lot, heading south in a hurry. Evelyn took a moment to breathe, then turned her ignition. She waited for a pair of delivery vans to go by before trailing the truck, always leaving a few cars and a traffic light's length between them, trying her best to look like just another commuter out on the edge of Albuquerque. The truck worked its way onto Route 67, taking unfamiliar back roads past old warehouses and empty railroad spurs. Evelyn's heart pounded with every mile. Now and then, she almost lost sight of them behind a semi or past a cluster of trees, but she kept her headlights low and stayed patient, trusting her reporter's instincts to carry her through. Finally, after more than half an hour, the truck turned off down a gravel drive that disappeared behind wild cottonwoods and the ruins of an old barn. Evelyn parked out of sight and quietly slipped out, knees brushing grass that came up to her waist. She crouched behind a tangle of tumbleweed, squinting through the leaves, as the men dragged those same identical boxes into the crumbling farmhouse. The place looked abandoned, but the men's constant glances and tense body language screamed trouble. Taking out her cell phone, Evelyn dialed Detective Lee, whispering her location. A property out near the Indian School Road cutoff, past the River's Bend. As she pressed the phone to her chest and tried to stay as still as possible, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The men had pulled someone from the back of the truck, someone wrapped in a light hoodie and jeans, hands tied and eyes covered. The sight hit her like a physical blow. Even after all this time, Evelyn would have known her daughter anywhere. Julia looked older, thinner, changed by years, lost to secrets, but the line of her jaw and the tilt of her head were unmistakable to a mother. The world seemed to twist. Her search for truth was now inseparable from her hope that Julia had survived. Panic threatened to paralyze her, but Evelyn forced herself to call Lee again, this time pleading for urgent help. Hidden and alone, she knew she was up against something far bigger than she had ever guessed, but she was more determined than ever to see it through, no matter the danger. Evelyn pressed herself so low to the ground that the wild grass left streaks on her arms and jeans as she tried to control her breathing. She kept her phone on silent, glued to her hand, eyes darting between the abandoned farmhouse and the truck. Every sound was sharper now. The distant creak of wood, the muffled orders, and the uneven crunch of boots on dry earth. She hugged the tangle of weeds for cover, fighting the urge to run straight for her daughter, but knowing a move like that would blow any chance of rescue. Suddenly, the mood at the property shifted. Greg's voice cut through the air, calling her name, but now with a cold edge that made her blood freeze. He wasn't bothering with polite explanations or gentle reassurances anymore. Instead, he barked orders to the other men, sending them to sweep the area. Flashlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the thick grass and low brush with a practiced menace. Evelyn realized that what had started as a collection of nervous glances and offhand bribes had turned into open threats. Greg was angry, desperate, maybe even frightened by how close the truth was to the surface. Crouched low, heart pounding, Evelyn heard slammed car doors and heavy steps spreading out. The men fanned out, searching behind rusted hulks of old farm equipment, paws of light sweeping terrifyingly close. She stayed as still as she could, every muscle tight as piano wire, and tried to keep Julia's face in her mind, reminding herself who this was for and why she could not give up. Sweat trickled down her back as one man with a thick accent muttered about finding the lady quick. It would only be a few minutes before someone stumbled across her hiding spot, and the thought made her stomach churn. She risked a last call to Detective Lee, barely mouthing a word, hoping the dispatcher could trace the signal before the worst happened. Her whole body was trembling, both from fear and adrenaline. Then, as the men moved in a tighter circle, the night erupted with the distant wail of sirens, a sound so out of place in the quiet dark that everyone seemed to freeze. In that instant, panic took hold. Greg and his men scattered, shouting over each other as they sprinted for the woods or dove into the truck. Within moments, they were gone, leaving only muddy footprints, 2 dropped flashlights, and a heavy taste of dread in the air. Evelyn stayed hidden, shaking, wishing the police would reach her and Julia before another secret could slip away forever. In the heavy silence after the sirens, police cruisers arrived with a rush of headlights and the crunch of tires on gravel. Dozens of officers fanned out, their voices loud and decisive as they swept through the ruined buildings and the wild, overgrown yard. Detective Lee was one of the first on the scene. With his badge glinting in the flashing blue lights, he led the charge, shouting orders and searching frantically for Evelyn and Julia. Greg's escape was short-lived. The officers caught him and his accomplices not far from the property, forcing them out of the truck at gunpoint along the shoulder of Indian School Road. Evelyn, still huddled near the barn, held her breath as she heard Greg shout obscenities and spit out a string of bitter, hateful words. Gone was any trace of the friend she once knew. His anger tumbled out, raw and ugly, making it clear that greed, jealousy, and a need to control had driven him to this point. All the old memories of shared cookouts and neighborhood block parties withered in the harsh light of what he had done. Back at the farmhouse, the police tore open the boxes, pulling out stacks of shredded paper, computer drives, and evidence that would give prosecutors plenty to work with. They called for paramedics. Someone covered Julia in a thermal blanket as she shivered on the tailgate of an ambulance. Detective Lee gently led Evelyn to her daughter. When Evelyn saw Julia sitting there, her face streaked with tears, but unmistakably alive, she broke down. They clung to each other with all the strength they had left, sobbing against years of fear and loss. All the words that could not be said seemed to hang in the air between their arms. Doctors later confirmed that Julia had survived unthinkable things since the night the balloon fell, a botched cover-up that became something far worse. The stories she and Evelyn pieced together with Lee's help unveiled murders that Greg had engineered, plus years of abuse and exploitation hidden by an unspoken code among the company's insiders. The truth landed heavily, shattering what little remained of the old life Evelyn remembered. Still, as the sun came up and the chaos faded, mother and daughter held hands, facing the uncertain path ahead. They knew it would be hard, rebuilding after so much loss, but for now they were together, and that was the first step toward healing. The first rays of morning filtered through the hospital's tall windows, casting long patterns over the pale tiles and metal benches where Evelyn waited. Every minute stretched on forever as nurses called out unfamiliar names and carts clicked down the corridor. She sat hunched over, gripping a styrofoam cup of coffee she had picked up at the vending machine on the third floor. The exhaustion in her bones was matched only by the sharp ache in her heart. Next to her, Julia slept curled under a thin blanket, her bandaged wrists cradled in her lap, breathing slow and uneven from all she had endured. It was in that grey, drifting lull that Detective Lee returned with news. He sat carefully in the plastic chair and spoke in a gentle voice that still managed to carry the weight of finality. Michael, Evelyn's husband, missing for months, hope slipping away a piece at a time, was gone. The accident that began as a clever sabotage had left him no chance. The medical examiner's report confirmed what deep down she had been afraid to accept. All Evelyn could do was nod, pressing her fist hard against her mouth to stifle a sob, so as not to wake Julia. But even as her chest tightened with grief, Evelyn realized the other side of the impossible story before her. Julia was here, held by her hand, saved from whatever unthinkable fate Greg and his crew had planned. She couldn't help but feel an odd mix of gratitude and sadness. The luck that spared her daughter had come at a price she could not ever forget. In quiet tones, Detective Lee filled in the missing pieces. Skewed company records, secret deals, all buried under the shiny slogan of Sky West's promise of adventure. For years, Folks had been drawn into a web of manipulation and greed, thinking they were part of something exciting, never knowing they were dancing on top of a tragedy. It was early afternoon before Julia finally woke. They turned toward each other and hugged tightly, letting out heavy breaths they had been holding for so long. In that small, bright hospital room, Evelyn squeezed Julia's hand and made herself a promise. The past would leave scars, and nothing would ever be simple again, but together they would try to build something new. One day at a time, embracing the family they had left and learning to hold both grief and hope. They had found their way back to each other, and for now that would have to be enough.